Thank you, Jennifer. Some of you know that today is our wedding anniversary, and you're wondering why my wife is not here. Do we have a fight on our anniversary? And no, we didn't. She is helping my sister make a presentation at Clouzet Springs, and I will see her in about 6 hours, and I think I can handle that. Maybe. If you want to wish a happy anniversary, you can do it to the Turners, because Charlie and Linda also got married on February 14. We were very original. Thank you for being here. Because of the day, I'd like for you to do me a favor and turn to one, somebody on the left, somebody on the right, shake their hand and say, God loves you and I do too. Now, if you can't say it, don't say it. Thank you. Appreciate that. So we continue with our series on the last day events today, birth pangs of Mother Nature. I was about 5.5 years old when I made my first trip abroad, and that was not much of a trip, but it was for me at that time. And I went from Argentina to Santiago. We flew to Santiago, Chile, and then drove to Chillán to see some family members. My father is from Chile, And one night, I don't remember anything about that trip, really, to be honest with you. That should be no surprise, but I don't remember anything except one night, in the middle of the night, maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, my mother came to get me. She says, get up real quick. And I woke up and I heard people screaming. And I heard dogs barking. And the front door, because I was close to the front door, sleeping close to was open, and I saw no lights outside. Everything was dark, but a lot of people out there. And the ground was moving. So we went outside and kind of shook with everybody else. And what I remember distinctly was seeing the roofs of these humble homes, many of them with tin roofs, like water waves. They were doing this. They were just doing that for about a minute. And that was my first experience to an earthquake. Now, I've been to earthquakes. I lived in California for about 20 years. And I've been to other earthquakes as well. I've been to Japan, where they are really used to earthquakes. That's the country that is best prepared for earthquakes. If the Japanese don't know how to do it, nobody else does, because they really know how to do that. Because they have earthquakes almost every day, just about every day. Bigger and smaller and so forth, mostly bigger. Well, earthquakes is one of the signs that Jesus told us would be a sign of His coming. And He warned us about that, and this is why we're going to study that. He actually talked about 4 kinds of signs. He spoke about religious signs, and He spoke about physical or natural signs, and He spoke about political signs, and He spoke about social life signs. And we're going to tackle one of those today. There will be famines, pestilences, pandemics, for example, and earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of sorrows. And this is important to understand. Many of you who know this passage well understand it already, but some may not know that the word sorrows there is literally, it's from the literal Greek that says birth pangs. Now, every mother who has had children understands why birth pangs can be sorrows, It's not a pleasant experience necessarily. So birth pangs, this is the beginning of birth pangs. And what are birth pangs about? Birth pangs is what tells you whether that baby is coming sooner or later. And you have contractions, and that is measured by the frequency and the intensity. The more frequent those contractions come and the more intense they are, the closer that baby is coming. So that's something we need to keep in mind every time we look at the signs that Jesus told us about in Matthew 24 or in Luke 21 or in Mark chapter 13. Earthquakes, famines, pestilences, and there will be fearful signs and great signs from heaven. And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, in the stars. I'm just focusing on the natural signs, the physical signs. So these signs we knew were markers, at one point, were markers of when the beginning of the time of the end was. And the beginning of that would be at the end of the 18th century and at the beginning of the 19th century. What about these fearful signs from heaven? What are they? The jury's still out on that. I'm not exactly sure, but there is a hint about that, because one of the things that Jesus spoke about when he gave all of those details in Matthew 24, he broke history into 3 sections. The first one were the first 40 years leading to the destruction of Jerusalem and signs that led to that. The second one had to do with a long period of the Great Tribulation, as he called it, which was over 1,000 years that covers the Middle Ages. And the last part of it is the time of the end, which is the last couple hundred years that we have been living on. Well, you and I have not been living the last 200 years, but within this time. So one of the things we can expect is that these things will be repeated. And so, what are these fearful signs? It's interesting that Josephus gave us a clue. Josephus lived in the time leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, which is that first historical period. And this is what he said. He recorded that when the temple burned, which was in AD 70, a bright star resembling a sword appeared, and comets were visible for a year. So that was unusual heavenly activity. And maybe we are going to see some unusual heavenly activity similar to what happened in that first historical period. But we don't know yet what that will be like. And on the earth, Jesus said, there will be distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. Hold on to this statement. This is interesting. The sea and the waves roaring. Men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now that reminds me of this text, Isaiah 34, that says, all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. That should remind you of another text in the Bible. But the first time it shows up is in Isaiah 34. All their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine and a fruit falling from a fig tree. Scholars tell us that this is not exclusively meant to be about Judah, but this is a universal statement about the time of the end as well, when the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll, and the house shall fall down as the leaf falls from the fig trees. So, in Revelation chapter 6, we have a similar statement, the description of what will be like when Jesus is about to come. I looked when he opened the 6th seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake. Keep that in mind. A great earthquake. That's repeated later in Revelation. A great earthquake. I think we have not seen in the history of earthquakes that type of earthquake, because there is such a thing as a 7.0 or 7.5 or 8.2 or even 9 point or 9.1 magnitude earthquake, which are absolutely devastating. But a 10.0 earthquake has not happened yet in the history of the world. You know why? Because a 10.0 destroys everything. Nothing is left standing. But we're told that there would be a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by mighty wind. So, echoing what Isaiah 34 said, then the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. Now, that's going to be a major thing, and nobody's going to miss any of that. But that's going to be upon the heels of his coming. So to review, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, fearful heavenly sights, sea and waves in upheaval, and the powers of the heavens shaken, but that is in conjunction with the actual coming of the Lord, that last point. So let's talk a little bit about famines. Are we seeing famines? How could we see famines in a world that is so rich with food? We have come the 21st century. We can feed the world twice over, everybody, and still have food left over. How could there be any famine under those conditions? That was not the case a few centuries ago. It was not the case during world wars, for example, when famine was real because of the conflicts. But when you don't have major conflicts, even in major conflicts, you have Russia and Ukraine in a major conflict, and yet they're not starving to death, neither country is starving to death, and they are even exporting food to other people. So how could that possibly be? Well, global death from famines, if you take that from 1870 all the way to 2023, you see that it went up all the way in the 1930s, 1940s, even 1960s, and then it took a drastic drop, which means we're good. We're good. So that doesn't seem to be a problem. I went back to the 16th century and I checked what are the major famines in the 16th century. There were 48 major famines in the 16th century. The 17th century had 72. The 18th century, 60. The 19th century, 50. So it just kind of goes back and forth. And then the 20th century, 79. So this is the high point in the 20th century. But you can say, well, that's probably because there were those two world wars that really were so devastating to so many people. In fact, 129 million people died as a result of that. That's a huge amount. That's a huge amount. So what we have in the 21st century so far, 17 major famines. But we have gone a fourth of the century, right? 25 years have gone by. A fourth of the century. If you calculate that at the same rate, we'll end up with 68 major famines, supposedly. It can be higher, it can be lower. But the irony is, even though we're not seeing an increase in frequency and intensity, if anything, it might be somewhat of a declension, the truth is that this can change at any time. Because the 20th century told us how that can change. A major war can really become devastating to the people that are involved in it. And you cannot plant, you cannot do agriculture the way that you did before, and you have problems importing food and so forth and so on. The tragic irony with famines is that we have enough food to feed the entire world easily. In fact, the United States alone will probably have enough food to feed the entire world. But many are overfed while others suffer hunger. So we have a case in which God is somewhat allowing us to see our own responsibility in this process. And that we'll come to that in a little bit, in a couple minutes. Pestilences. What about pestilences, pandemics, and and so forth. Well, I went back to the 16th century. I wanted to go like 500 years and see any trends. You have two major pandemics, and that cost 65 million deaths. This is a major problem, right? You have another two in the 20th century, a much less number of casualties. And then you have another two in the 18th century, which less number of people dying. In the 19th century, you have three major pandemics. And in the 20th century, you have four major pandemics with millions and millions being affected. And in the 21st century, even though we've gone only 1/4 of a century so far, we have five. Now, in this case, we have a clear trend. And the trend is not a good trend. It's a trend that speaks about frequency and intensity. You have more and more, and in this century, it just jumped out of its box, if you will, because if you calculate, I mean, the last century you have 4, and in this century, if this continues, you'll have 20. So that is 5 times more than what we had just the previous century. That is a clear trend of frequency and intensity. So you have this, we're talking about major pandemics that have affected large numbers of people. How about earthquakes? Well, I'm going to spend most of the time on this because this is the clearest evidence we have that frequency and intensity really are Jesus really was right on this aspect, and now we can see it better than ever before. This is the Ring of Fire. You see this, right? And so all of these areas of the world have earthquakes all the time. The yellow ones don't have it as much, but from Chile on up to Peru, and then some in Central America, and then you get to California, and especially Alaska, we have a lot more earthquakes in America, in Alaska, than in California, by the way, even though we think of California as earthquake country. And then you have the same process in most of the South Sea islands are super earthquake prone. There is one earthquake after another on that. And then Indonesia, probably of all the nations of the world, the one that has had the most earthquakes is Indonesia, Osdi. So just want to warn you. Indonesia and then Japan. Both of these countries have huge numbers. And then the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, that has it too. And some along the Himalayas, the fault of the Himalayas, you have that in India and Pakistan. And there are other sections of the country that just never have it, or is of the world that never have it. The black dots are the ones that are 9 point or more or higher. So you see how rare that is. It's very rare to have a 9 point magnitude earthquake. And when it does come, it's very devastating. We live in an age where earthquakes can be human-induced. This is the first time in the history of the world that we can actually cause earthquakes. Mining activity, oil extraction activity, all of that lends to that. And one of the clear evidences is Oklahoma. There is a lot of oil extraction in Oklahoma, and now Oklahoma has more earthquakes than California. Can you believe it? You thought it was just, wind or something. The USGS, the United States Geological Survey, has identified 852 magnitude 3 or higher earthquakes in the central USA between 1973 and 2008. Between 2009 and 2017, that number has jumped to 3,258. So 3 times what normal. Now, to have some perspective, 7.0 earthquake is a major earthquake, okay? In fact, there's a lot of devastation with a 6.2 or 6.5 earthquake many times, even 5.5, depending on where it is or whether there are a lot of people living there or you have concrete type of buildings that are bound to be destroyed and squash people. If an 8 this is equivalent to a 7-point earthquake, okay? An 8.0 earthquake is a great earthquake. That's much more serious than 7. This is not simply 10% or 7% higher. This is exponentially more serious than the other one. 9% is considered extreme, and 10%, 9.0, 10.0 is considered catastrophic. In other words, nothing survives that. What is a relative comparison? So we have an idea. An 8.0 earthquake yields 32 times more energy release and has 10 times greater shaking amplitude than its 7.0. What does that mean? It is 32 times stronger. Not 10 times stronger, not 5 times. This is 32 times stronger, and it's 10 times much more, it covers much more territory than the 7.0. And 9.0 earthquake yields 1,000 times more energy. Not just 32, not just 64, not just 100. 1,000 times more energy and 100 times greater amplitude. It's like 100 times larger than the earthquakes that are 8.0. And the 10 earthquake is 32,000. This is 10,000 times more. This is 32,000 times more and 1,000 times more ground in covering the ground. So it would just cover a huge territory. I spent a lot of time writing these things down, and I wondered about my sanity. I said, do I really need to do this? But for the sake of perspective, I looked at every earthquake that took place, and the USGS can follow that because they can trace the faults. They can do. It's not. They can tell that by looking at the geology. So. There were only 7 earthquakes in the entire century, the 16th century, the 1500s. Only 7 that were 7.0 or higher, okay? And you see where they are. In Turkey, yeah, that makes sense. China, Chile, Alaska, Japan, all of those are earthquake countries, okay? We had no record of casualties at that point. When you get into the 17th century, then you get into more of the same countries, including Indonesia and China and Japan, Italy. Italy's another one. Look at that. 19,500 people died in that earthquake in 1638. And then even Canada has some earthquakes from time to time, right along where Alaska has them. And look at China. In 1668, they had an earthquake that killed 42,578 people. That's a small city. Completely killed. And then you have in Italy in 1693, 60,000 died. In China in 1695, over 100,000 were estimated dead. In total, you have 19. What did we have from the previous one? We had 7. Now we had 19. So that's almost 3 times more, okay? Remember, like birth pangs, frequency and intensity, and we see that with the earthquakes in a very clear way. So let's get into the 18th century. The earthquakes that were 7.0 or above. You get to Iran and you have 80,000 deaths because of that earthquake. In 1718, China experienced 73,000 deaths because of the earthquake. In China, again, 50,000 died. And then the famous earthquake that many of us Adventists know about from history, the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. Remember? 80,000 people died. And many of them died because of that tsunami, which, if you remember, 22 years ago, 21 years ago in Indonesia, the Indian Ocean tsunami, and wiped out so many people. That same type of thing happened then. In fact, many Christians in Europe believe this was clearly the beginning of the end. This was the beginning of the end. And they were not incorrect about that, because prophetically they were only a few years off from it. But it was a warning that it was coming. So we continue with the 18th century, and you have some other countries. In Iran here, 120,000 people died in 1774. Well, okay, so far we have about 21 earthquakes. And then we finish with this: 100,000 died in China, and in the border between Peru and Ecuador, 41,000 people died. That's 25 earthquakes that century, massive, great, big earthquakes. Come to 19th century, and we see that we even had an earthquake in Missouri. And you may have read about this, or in school you may remember that. Not my school, because I didn't grow up here. So 1811, the Missouri earthquake, and that was, it's considered 3 earthquakes that happened one after the other. In Venezuela, 17,000 people died in 1812. And then we have more. Nepal, Indonesia, Martinique. It gets wider. In other words, the locations get more creative. More nations that had not experienced earthquakes before are now experiencing earthquakes. New Zealand, for example, and in Japan, Greece, Argentina, Chile, of course, is an earthquake country. Chile, Indonesia, Japan, Alaska, etc. And then this continues, and now we have 38, which surpasses all of the previous centuries, but we continue counting until we get to 45. In the 19th century, we have 45. So this is keeping an upward trend. And we say, okay, so that is going the direction that Jesus said it would happen, until we get to the 20th century. And the 20th century blows this off the roof. Because the 20th century is not simply 20 or 30 or 40 earthquakes, okay? We start with Alaska and then keep going. This is the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 that many of us are familiar with. And then you have other earthquakes in Italy. 82,000 people died in 1908. And then in Italy again in 1915, 32,000 people died. In China in 1920, catch this, 273,000 people died because of one earthquake. That's a city like Chattanooga. In Chattanooga, everybody dead. Can you imagine that? And by now we're at 43 earthquakes in that single century. And then we have Japan. 142,000 people died in that earthquake in 1923. And obviously it's happening more frequently. I mean, we are at 50 earthquakes only at 1929. So we still have 70 years to go of earthquakes. And it continues more and more. And we have Myanmar, where before it didn't happen. And we have Iran, which before it didn't happen. Now it's happening regularly in Iran. Iran is an earthquake country as far as Central Asia is concerned. And China, of course, that's the case. 60,000 died in 1935 in Pakistan. But we're now at 79 earthquakes. 28,000 in Chile in 1939. 32,000 in Turkey. In all of these, by the way, are in the present locations. In other words, when it happened, it may have been called something else, but this is to facilitate where it is for us. And so now we're at 86, and now we're at 94, and now we're 101 in the 20th century, and we're still not in 1950. We haven't come to half of the century. And then we got, for example, this earthquake in 1948, Turkmenistan. 110,000 people died as a result of that earthquake. And now we're at 115, and we continue on, and it just keeps being relentless. One earthquake after another, one earthquake after another. And this one, this is the largest earthquake that we have experienced as far as American territory. That is Alaska earthquake in 1964, 9.2. I've seen pictures of that. And it's the Anchorage earthquake, and it was quite devastating. The good thing, many times you see casualties 0. You know, one thing that I've observed, having spent so many hours looking at this data, is that many of these earthquakes are actually happening in atolls or in islands or in areas where there are very few people, if any. And it just makes me wonder, is God controlling that too? Is God diverting that? Because clearly, Ephesians 2 says that the devil is the prince of the power of the air. He wants to destroy. He's in the business of destroying. But I think that God is pushing him back and keeping it as sane as possible, because so many of these earthquakes could be so much more devastating than they really are. And sometimes we have reminders of that. When that happens in a busy city, you got thousands and thousands of people dying. So we got to 143 earthquakes, and then 150 earthquakes in a huge variety of countries. Morocco even has earthquakes. Colombia has earthquakes. The Solomon Islands have earthquakes. So look at this. This is completely off the chart. Myanmar, Guatemala has earthquakes. The Philippines have earthquakes. Look at China, 1976. I remember this. I remember when this happened. 242,000 people died in China. They wanted to keep a lid on it. It took weeks and weeks for that truth to come out, because they didn't want to acknowledge that they had such a devastating earthquake and that so many people died. Because much of that had to do with bad construction, just poor construction habits. So the Chinese have gotten much better at that now. We're at 185 earthquakes for the century, and this keeps going. 50,000 in Iran died, and we're at 206 earthquakes that century, so much more than any previous centuries. And we're getting to the end here. 17,000 died in 1999 in Turkey. Talk about frequency and intensity. In the 20th century, major and larger earthquakes jumped from 45 in the previous century, which was the highest number, to 227. 5 times as much. Even nature is trying to tell us that Jesus is coming soon. Even nature is trying to tell us that Jesus is coming soon. So, let's look at the 21st century. There's only 25 years in this century so far, right? So we should be done very quickly. Think again. So 15 earthquakes. India. They didn't have earthquakes in the past. But they're now having earthquakes, okay? 20,000 casualties. And this keeps going and keeps going and keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. And look at this, Indonesia. This is the famous Indian Ocean tsunami, remember? 227,000 people died as a result of that, not just in Indonesia, but in nearby countries as well. And this keeps going. In Pakistan, 87,000 people dead. This keeps going and going and going and going. China, 87,000. I remember that one too. 87,000 died in China, even though they had gotten better in anticipating that and being ready for it. Do you remember this one? I bet you remember this one. I remember I gave money for this. Not for the earthquake. I gave money for the victims of the earthquake. At 7.0, 238,000 people died in Haiti. It was devastating. The poorest country in the world, and has this experience. And this keeps going. We are only at 210, and we already have 153 earthquakes, which is as many as about 15 centuries previous to the 20th. Something is happening. Okay? You remember this one too, right? 2011 in Japan. Hokkaido, where the nuclear plant was, and people were concerned about it. 20,000 people died. And this keeps going. 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 And it's like, what in the world is happening in this century? Okay? I did a study on this back in 2013. And based on what I learned in 2013, I projected that we will have, at the end of this century, if we last, that we will have approximately just over 1,000 earthquakes this century. Well, now that we have a whole 25 years to study, based on that, I was quite a bit short from what it needs to be. And so we keep going and 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 going. 60,000 in the 21st century, 61,000 people dying of an earthquake. Okay, we've come to the end. 370 earthquakes in just 25 years. We're talking about major earthquakes. There are 1,000 more earthquakes. Thousands more that were minor, that were smaller, even though a 6.9 can be just as devastating as 7.0 or 7.5, basically. So let's look at it this way. 16th century, this is as many. Remember? 7, okay? And then the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. It was increasing, but slowly increasing. By the time you get to the 20th century, this is what you find. A huge jump in the 20th century. And then, when you get to the 21st century, the first 25 years of the 21st century dwarf the entire amount of the earthquakes in the 20th century, even though it's been only 25 years. So based on those 25 years, this is what we can expect. Okay? This is what we can expect. About 1,448 earthquakes, completely unheard of, writing new history. Even nature is trying to tell us that Jesus is coming soon. And I know that nature is inanimate and cannot choose, does not choose, but there's a sense in which God is saying, speaking to us through nature. And that is the same sense, if you read Romans 1 and you say, this is how God is speaking to secular people. He speaks to secular people through the circumstances of what happened in the world and what happens in around us. So the last point, seas and waves in upheaval. The seas and waves in upheaval have a great deal to do with climate change. And believe it or not, global warming is a thing. It's not a thing. It is a thing. For millennia, changes were rather insignificant, but not since the Industrial Revolution. Burning fossil fuels and deforestation, for example, have created global warming. This has caused shifting weather patterns, rising temperatures and release of more and more carbon dioxide, an increase of 1.3 degrees Celsius, which is 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit, since 1880. And you say, well, that's not much. That's a global raise. That alone has led to more frequent heat waves, storms, and changes in rainfalls. Birds are migrating earlier and changing their routes. Sea creatures are changing their habitats. Flowers are blooming sooner. Ice caps are melting at accelerated rates. Sea levels are rising, and the earth is warming. There is more and more flooding and droughts. The biggest difference now is the speed of the change. It's getting faster and faster. The changes appear minor, but they make significant impacts. For example, a 1.5 percentage degrees Celsius rise in temperature does not melt ice caps. But a 2% degree temperature rise does. And as soon as you start melting that, as soon as Antarctica starts melting, as soon as Greenland starts melting, I don't think that Trump is going to want Greenland as soon as it starts melting, because it's going to be a huge problem. It's going to be a very big problem that is not going to be that solvable. So global warming is the thing. Listen to this from NASA. As Earth climate changes, it is impacting extreme weather across the planet. Record-breaking heat waves on land and on the ocean, drenching rains, severe floods, years-long drought, extreme wildfires, and widespread flooding during hurricanes are all becoming more frequent and more intense. Did they get a peek at my sermon script? No, this is what they concluded. The same conclusion that we can make when we read Matthew 24. Even nature is trying to tell us that Jesus is coming soon. According to NASA, these are the effects of climate change. Floods, high tide flooding, marine heat waves, heat extremes, wildfires, fires, droughts, tropical cyclones, heavy precipitation. So a lot of these have to do with water. Water. And that's what we read from Jesus. The sea is going to be in upheaval. These things are not going to work normally. Listen to from a statement from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Drought can harm food production and human health. Flooding can lead to spread of disease, death, and damage ecosystems and infrastructure. Human health issues that result from drought, flooding, and other weather conditions increase the death rate, change food availability, and limit how much a worker can get done, and ultimately the productivity of our economy. And if our economy starts flagging, that's when people start getting serious. They said, okay, we need to do something. This is an interesting thing. You should see it live, moving. This is 1964, how the relationship between heat and cool weather was on Earth. That was 60 years ago. 60 years later, this is what it's like. That's a radical change. Much more heat than normal. Much more heat than cool weather. Even nature is trying to tell us that Jesus is coming soon. Pew Research a few years ago revealed that 41% of Americans believe Jesus will return by 2050. 41%. Of course, most of them are probably thinking, I hope it's not before 1948 or something, so I can get my life together in the meantime. The truth is, we don't know. He may be here in 3 months. He may be here next summer. He may be here before your next birthday, unless it happens to be this week or something, probably. The ice is melting. The last countries before the Antarctica are Chile and Argentina. And they're massive ice countries. They are as large as Delaware, those things. And when they get cut off and they start floating around, that's a major problem. And of course, they start melting. When you have tsunamis, the way that we have seen in 2004 or in 2011, that's a very serious thing. I saw not long ago a documentary on what happened in the ocean, the Indian Ocean tsunami, and it's really shocking. You have forest fires, the result of the global warming. All of this is related. You have hurricanes and all of these things getting more fearsome and more frequent. And Luke 21:26 says, men's hearts will fail them for fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. That's going to be our neighbors. That's going to be our friends many times. That may be some of our family members. My hope is that you do not, because you saw this coming. And you said, my heart is with Jesus. My future is in His hands. And I know these are signs of His coming. And I'm just waiting for that coming. I'm not going to worry about the signs. I'm going to worry about His return. In Revelation 11:18, we have a very insightful commentary. The nations were angry, and your wrath, says John, has come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should destroy those who destroy the earth. Wow. So the more this happens as a result of human activity, careless human activity, the more God is going to have to rectify that and bring about justice in the process. So it is inevitable. We're there. Look up. All of these things are telling us that Jesus is coming. I want to remind you about one last thing. Do you remember, well, we weren't there, but you have read about when Jesus died on the cross, right? And you have read that for 3 hours, the sun did not give its light, from 12 noon till 3 in the afternoon. Ellen White comments, this is an interesting statement that she has in The Desire of Ages. She says that the sun refused to shine. Now, you can only refuse if you have a will, but this is how she wanted to express that with as much weight as possible. This is what she said: inanimate nature expressed sympathy with its insulted and dying author. The sun refused to look upon the awful scene. It was as deep as midnight without moon or stars. So just like 2,000 years ago, nature reacted to the sacrifice of our Lord and Savior, to the sacrifice of God on the cross. Nature is also reacting now to what is coming and what Jesus has promised. Even nature is trying to tell us that Jesus is coming soon. How many of you want to say, I want to be ready for that? I want to be ready. God bless you. Thank you.